Not all treasures are worth dying for. That's what I learned on the bloodiest night of my life. The gunshots echoed through the night like thunder rolling across the plains. One shot, then another, followed by screams that silenced even the night birds perching in the cottonwoods. Sarah Blackwood fell to her knees in the mud outside Colt Harrington's ranch gate. Blood streaked her cheek like war paint. Her dress was torn, her auburn hair wild and matted with sweat. Her arms clutched a wooden box against her chest as if it were a child she was protecting. Inside his workshop, Colt Harrington paused mid-strike, the hammer hovering above the red-hot iron on his anvil. At 40, his face was weathered like sun-baked leather, eyes sharp as a hawk's from years as a frontier scout. A jagged scar ran down his right forearm, reminder of an Apache raid in '58 and the price of letting your guard down. He set down his tools, grabbed his Colt Peacemaker from the workbench, and stepped outside. The moon hung full and heavy in the sky, casting enough light for him to see the woman sprawled before his gate. "They killed him," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry kindling. "They're coming." Then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed completely. Colt moved fast, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Years of breaking horses and hauling timber had made him strong, but there was something about the woman's stillness that made his stomach turn. He carried her inside the cabin, laid her gently on the wooden bench near the hearth where the embers still glowed. The wound on her side was seeping blood, dripping onto his floorboards in a steady rhythm. Colt grabbed a clean rag, poured whiskey over it, and pressed it against her side. Sarah's eyes fluttered open with a gasp of pain. "Easy," she breathed, face contorted. "It hurts." "I know," Colt said quietly, his voice low and steady, like he was calming a spooked horse. "It'll be over quick." He cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to leave a trail, enough for men to follow. As he worked, his ears caught the distant sound of hoofbeats, still far but coming closer with each passing minute. "They're coming," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Sarah's eyes found his, wide with fear but clear. "How many bullets do you have?" Colt's mouth twitched, not quite a smile but close. "Enough." When Sarah fully regained consciousness, she was wrapped in a blanket, the pain in her side dulled to a throb. The cabin was spare but solid, built by a man who valued function over comfort. Colt sat across from her, watching, his revolver resting on his knee. "3 men," she began, her voice steadier now. "They came after midnight, kicked in our door. One held me down. Another ransacked the house. The third," she paused, swallowing hard. "The third beat Robert with a shovel. I heard his skull crack. They kept asking about gold." Colt's eyes narrowed. "Your husband have any gold worth killing for?" Sarah shook her head, fingers clutching the blanket. "Robert liked to talk big in town. Said we'd be rich soon. But it was just talk. We barely had enough to eat most days. We didn't even own the house." She glanced at the wooden box now sitting on Colt's table. "I grabbed that on instinct when I ran. No idea why. It was under the table." Colt nodded toward it. "What's inside?" "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe whatever they were looking for." Her eyes suddenly widened. "One of them will recognize your place. Big man, broken nose. Mike. He worked for us last spring. Fixed our roof. He knows this area." Colt stood, checking his revolver. "Then he knows me too." His fingers unconsciously traced the scar on his arm, a habit from when trouble was brewing. "You're not planning to fight them?" Sarah asked, alarm spreading across her face. Colt looked out the window. The moon cast long shadows across his property. "You got a better idea?" When she didn't answer, he walked to the back room. He moved a wooden barrel aside, revealing a trap door covered in dust. "Hider's hole," he explained. "Big enough for one. Quiet enough to wait them out." He lifted the trap door, then looked over his shoulder at Sarah. "You can sit here and worry, or you can help me set a trap they'll never forget." From beneath the floorboards, Colt pulled out a worn leather case. Inside lay a Winchester 73 rifle, gleaming with oil, and two more Colt Peacemakers, all meticulously maintained. He checked each weapon with practiced hands, hands that had killed before and would likely kill again tonight. "The forge will be our first diversion," he explained, laying out his plan. "I've got blasting powder from clearing stumps. We'll rig it under the anvil. When they get close enough," he made a gesture with his hand, "then I'll take position by the corral. They'll be silhouetted against the moonlight when they come through the gate." Sarah watched him, something shifting in her expression. "And me? You'll be safe in the hole." She shook her head. "They killed my husband. I want to help." Colt studied her for a long moment, then handed her a small derringer. "Last resort only. Aim for the body, not the head. Less chance of missing." The hoofbeats grew louder. 3 riders approaching slowly. "Tonight," Colt said, checking his rifle one last time, "they're going to learn what it feels like to be hunted." The 3 men rode up to Colt's gate with the confidence of predators who'd never been prey. Jackson, their leader, wore a long duster despite the warm night. Mike, with his broken nose bent like a lightning strike across his face, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Ryder, the youngest but mean as a snake, kept his hand near his gun belt. "Evening, Harrington," Jackson called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Saw some blood on your gate? Looks like you might be harboring something that belongs to us." Colt stood on his porch, rifle held casually across his body. "Only thing bleeding around here might be you if you don't turn around." Mike laughed, the sound ugly in the night air. "We know she's here. Woman in a torn dress, carrying a box that ain't hers." "Hand her over," Ryder added, "and we'll leave peaceful like." Colt smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I count 3 men who killed a defenseless farmer, beat his wife, and now want to finish the job. That about right?" Jackson's face hardened. "That woman's husband was a liar and a thief. Now step aside, or we burn this place to the ground." "Try it," Colt said quietly. The air hung still for 1 heartbeat. 2. Then Colt dropped a lit match down the side of his porch. The explosion at the forge sent a plume of fire and smoke into the night sky. The horses reared, nearly throwing their riders. In that moment of chaos, Colt fired twice. Ryder tumbled from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. Jackson and Mike scrambled for cover, returning fire wildly. Bullets splintered wood around Colt as he rolled behind a water trough. He'd counted on them splitting up. From his position, he could see Mike trying to circle around to the barn. Jackson was using his horse for cover, firing steadily at the porch. A bullet grazed Colt's arm, hot as a branding iron. He gritted his teeth, took careful aim, and put a bullet through Jackson's shoulder. The man screamed, dropping his gun. From the barn came another shot, not from Mike, but from higher up. Sarah, who must have climbed into the hayloft, had fired the derringer. Mike staggered, clutching his leg, then raised his gun toward the barn. Colt's rifle cracked once more, and Mike collapsed face first into the dirt. When the echo of gunfire faded, only the crackle of the burning forge and Jackson's pained groans remained. Jackson lay propped against the fence, blood soaking through his shirt. His breathing came in wet rattles. The smell of gunpowder and smoke hung heavy in the night air. Colt crouched beside him, pressing the barrel of his revolver under the man's chin. "Why Robert Blackwood?" he demanded. Jackson coughed, spitting blood. His eyes darted toward the barn, then back to Colt. "He owed us." "No," Colt said, pressing harder. "You owed him. He paid you for that roof work." Jackson's gaze shifted again to the barn, a flicker of fear crossing his face. "What's in the barn?" Colt asked, following the man's glance. When Jackson didn't answer, Colt pressed a rag hard against his wounded shoulder. Jackson screamed. "The gold!" he gasped. "Blackwood said he had gold." Colt frowned. Who told you that? Old man in town, Jackson wheezed, his strength fading. Stevens. Said Blackwood hit a vein near the creek. We came to collect. James Stevens? Colt asked, surprise evident in his voice. The storekeeper? Jackson nodded weakly. Said he'd give us a cut if we brought him the location. His head lolled to one side. You just buried yourself in the same dirt you put Blackwood in, Colt said quietly. Behind him, the barn door creaked. Sarah stood there, holding a lantern, her face pale but composed. Is he dead? Nearly, Colt answered, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. Says your husband actually had gold. Says James Stevens sent them. James? Sarah's brow furrowed. He's been like a father to Robert. Colt gestured toward the barn. Jackson kept looking that way. Might be worth checking. They pushed open the heavy doors together. The lantern light spilled across the dirt floor, illuminating old tools, hay bales, and the musty smell of aged wood. There's nothing here, Sarah said, setting the lantern down. Colt walked the perimeter, kicking at the ground. Suddenly the sound changed. Hollow. He dropped to his knees, brushing away dirt to reveal a trap door similar to the one in his cabin. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. Colt lifted it open. Inside, stacked neatly in a wooden chest, were gold coins, real ones, gleaming in the lantern light. Dozens of them. Sarah gasped. He wasn't lying. All that talk about buying land out west, he meant it. Her hands trembled as she touched the coins. Colt exhaled slowly. Your husband wasn't the liar after all. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the distant crackle of the forge broke the silence. He died for this, Sarah finally said, her voice barely audible. And we might live because of it, Colt replied, his hand instinctively moving to his gun as a new sound reached them. Hoofbeats, steady and measured, too deliberate to be a wild horse. Colt's expression hardened. We're about to have company. The hoofbeats grew closer. Colt stepped forward, rifle ready, his shadow stretching long across the barn floor. Sarah stood behind him, clutching the lantern, its flame trembling like her breath. A single rider appeared at the gate, a tall man in an old coat and dusty hat. He raised his hand slowly. Who are you? Colt called out, aiming at the stranger's chest. Name's Malcolm, the man replied, dismounting carefully. Sheriff from Cedar Ridge County. Colt lowered his rifle slightly but remained wary. Little far from your jurisdiction, Sheriff. Malcolm approached slowly, eyeing the bodies on the ground, then the gold gleaming in the barn. Heard gunshots. Came to see if anyone was still alive. His gaze lingered on the coins. Looks like you folks had yourselves quite a night. As the sheriff stepped closer, Colt noticed something that made his blood run cold. The badge on Malcolm's chest was polished to a shine, too new like it had never seen a day's wear. And there, on his sleeve cuff, a small dark stain that looked suspiciously like blood. These men murdered my husband, Sarah said. They came here to finish the job. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. Dangerous business, Gold. Makes men do terrible things. He looked directly at Colt. You two best get that buried. Folks kill for less out here. As the sheriff rode away, Colt watched him disappear into the darkness, a sense of unease settling in his gut. I don't trust him, Sarah said, voicing Colt's thoughts. Smart woman, Colt replied. That badge looked new, and he didn't ask nearly enough questions about 3 dead men on my property. They spent the night burying the bodies far from the house, then secured the gold in Colt's hider's hole. At dawn, they sat at Colt's table, drinking coffee and planning their next move. Stevens will wonder why his men haven't returned, Colt said, and that sheriff knows about the gold now. Sarah's fingers tightened around her cup. They'll come back with more men. Colt nodded, which gives us one advantage. We know they're coming. They spent the day setting traps. Colt showed Sarah how to use the Winchester, positioning her at the upstairs window where she'd have the best view of anyone approaching. They set tripwires, dug covered pits, and established crossfire positions with brutal efficiency. "Robert never let me touch his hunting rifle," Sarah said, sighting along the Winchester's barrel. "Said it wasn't ladylike." Colt watched her steady hands. "With respect to your late husband, ma'am, he was wrong about that too." Late that afternoon, as they were checking the last of their preparations, a horse's whinny froze them both in place. Through the trees came a single rider, a peddler with a cart of wares. Colt and Sarah exchanged glances. Coincidence or scout? Colt's hand moved to his revolver as he signaled Sarah to hide. "Afternoon," the peddler called. "Got some fine wares if you're interested." "Not today," Colt replied, stepping forward to block the man's view of the ranch. "Road's washing out ahead. You'd best turn back." The man's eyes darted around suspiciously, lingering a moment too long on the fresh dirt near the fence line. "You sure? Got some fine whiskey from Kentucky." "Quite sure," Colt said coldly. After the peddler left, Colt turned to Sarah. "They're getting desperate, sending scouts ahead. How long do we have?" "Not long." As dusk fell, they took their positions. 6 riders approached just after nightfall, moving in formation that suggested planning. At their lead rode Sheriff Malcolm, and beside him, to Colt's disgust, the stooped figure of James Stevens. "Remember," Colt whispered to Sarah before taking his position, "let them get close to the first trap before you fire. Then aim for the ones on the left while I take the right." The trap was sprung when the first rider hit the tripwire near the gate. The explosion ripped through the night, sending 2 men and their horses down immediately. The remaining 4 scattered, returning fire toward the house. Colt, positioned behind the water trough, picked off one rider with cool precision. Sarah's rifle cracked from upstairs and another man fell. Stevens and Malcolm took cover behind the barn wall, making them difficult targets. "Harrington," Malcolm shouted, "we know you're out there. You're harboring a fugitive and sitting on stolen property." Colt moved silently through shadows he knew by heart, his moccasin-clad feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. Years of tracking had taught him patience. Let them think they had the advantage. Stevens broke cover first, dashing toward the house. Sarah's rifle barked, and he stumbled, wounded but still moving. Malcolm used the distraction to circle toward the forge, not realizing he was walking into Colt's trap. The sheriff stepped directly into a hidden pit, falling hard enough to lose his weapon. Before he could recover, Colt was on him, pressing his revolver against the man's temple. "That badge bought legally, or did you steal that too?" Colt growled. A gunshot from the house drew his attention. Sarah screamed, not in pain but warning. Stevens had reached the porch, gun in hand. Colt spun, but knew he was too late. Another shot rang out, but it was Stevens who fell, a hole in his chest. Sarah stood in the doorway, Colt's second peacemaker smoking in her hand. "He was coming up the steps," she said simply. Malcolm, seeing his partner fall, raised his hands in surrender. "This ain't over, Harrington. That gold has an owner." "Had an owner," Colt corrected him. "He's buried on his property, thanks to you and your friends." A week later, they buried Robert Blackwood on the hill behind his homestead. The sun broke through the clouds just enough to warm the simple wooden cross Sarah had made. "He wasn't perfect," she said quietly as they stood by the grave. "But he didn't deserve to die like that." Colt removed his hat respectfully. "Few men do." They walked back to his wagon in silence, the box of gold secured beneath the seat. "What will you do now?" Colt asked as he helped her up. Sarah looked out across the plains, toward the mountains in the distance. "I don't want that gold anymore, Colt. It's taken too much already." "Gold's just metal," Colt said. "It's what you do with it that matters." She considered this. Robert always talked about buying land, building something that would last. Maybe that's still possible. Your husband's land is good. With some investment, it could be a fine ranch. I don't know the first thing about ranching, she admitted. Colt's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. I might know a thing or two. They used a portion of the gold to expand Colt's operation, buying adjacent land, including Robert's old property. The rest, at Sarah's insistence, was set aside to establish a fund for struggling farmers in the region. 1 month later, Colt rode into town with purpose in his stride. Sheriff Malcolm had returned to Cedar Ridge, but stories of that night had spread. People nodded respectfully as Colt passed. Not out of fear, but something else. Something earned. At the saloon, he confronted the bartender who'd been in league with Stevens and Malcolm. With the entire town as witness, he forced the man to confess his role in spreading lies about Robert's gold strike, setting up the murder for a cut of the profit. Justice isn't always about the law, Colt told the gathered crowd. Sometimes it's about the truth. 6 months later, the Harrington Ranch had become the most prosperous in the county. Sarah managed the books and ran the charitable fund that had already saved 3 families from ruin. The Wilsons had been the first. Tom Wilson, a farmer with 5 children and a failing wheat crop, had come to the Harrington Ranch with his hat in his hand. Pride swallowed. "Mr. Harrington," he'd said, "I heard you might be able to help." Now the Wilson farm was thriving, and Tom's eldest son had apprenticed with the blacksmith in town, learning a trade that would serve him well. Colt trained a local militia, ensuring what happened to Robert would never happen again on his watch. Sarah's scar from that night had healed to a thin white line across her ribs. Sometimes she would trace it with her fingers, remembering. Not the pain, but what came after. How she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. On cool evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "There are fires meant to destroy us," Colt said once, remembering the explosion that had started the fight for their lives. "And there are fires that forge us into something stronger," Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. She had been forged in that fire too, emerging not as a victim, but as a survivor, and more. "The scars remind us where we've been," she replied, touching her side, "but they don't have to dictate where we're going." The wind carried their words away across the plains, where new settlers were building homes, planting crops, starting lives, some with the help of gold that had once brought only death but now offered hope. And if you've made it this far into my story, friends, take a sip of your coffee or whiskey and tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Next time, I'll tell you about Colt's showdown with the Wells Gang in Storm on the Frontier. Remember, sometimes the darkest nights bring the brightest dawns. Until next time.